Welcome to Live with the Louhs with your hosts, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, our work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. My name is Father Nicholas Lowe, and I'm the parish priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church right here in the great city of Jacksonville, Florida. In fact, this is a ministry of our church family, and we're so excited to have you joining us this evening on this Tuesday, March 1st. You know, Live with the Louhs is a show that marries both faith and psychology to hopefully give you some practical steps to grow in your own walk of faith every single week. And we broadcast this show from Jacksonville every Tuesday from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you end up enjoying this show and you want to, we just encourage you, tell your friends, share it with people, help us to share Christ's light with the world. You know, before we dive into tonight's topic, we want to encourage you also to stay connected to us by joining our social media platforms. You know, we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, all under the headings of The Louhs. And that last name is spelled quite uniquely. It's spelled Louhs. It's The Louhs. In fact, our show is currently being broadcast live on our Louhs Facebook page, as well as on Ancient Faith Ministries Facebook page. And if you're listening to our show tonight, you know, last year, Roxanne and I began sending out these daily encouraging messages, just words of inspiration that we hope that will inspire people in their walk of faith. And every day we send these out. If you're a person that really likes to receive just some word of encouragement from a faith and psychological perspective, do us a favor right now during this show. Go to our website at thelouhs.com. Again, it's Louhs.com, and click on that subscribe button. All you have to do is simply put in your email address. There's no strings attached, and every single morning you're going to receive our daily word of encouragement. So many people are receiving those, and we're grateful for those who have received them. And please share them with your friends and family. But we also want to let you know that as we're beginning this season of Great Lent, we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. As we're about ready to begin the season of Great Lent, one of the great themes that we hear about throughout Lent is this theme of renewal. It's a return to the newness that Christ created all of us in. And our book came out last year called Renewing You. And if you're looking for some writings or some readings that will hopefully inspire you, also a book that would hopefully challenge you in your walk of faith, consider our book, Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, in which we take 8 of the biggest really topics that Roxanne and I see as a priest and as a psychologist and deal with them from those perspectives. At the end of every single chapter, there are several questions, really reflective questions. You know, the church fathers talk about the importance of us knowing ourselves and constantly studying ourselves. And so at the very end of every chapter, we give you some questions to truly reflect on your life. And the very first chapter is all about renewing our faith. So we encourage you, you can find the book here at Ancient Faith. You can simply go to store.ancientfaith.com. We also available on all of the different platforms on Borders and Barnes & Noble, on Amazon. And it's also available audibly. We're on audible.com. And it's recorded in our own voices. So please, if you're looking for a gift or you're looking for some renewal, definitely consider the book Renewing You. As we're about ready to begin tonight's show, we do encourage you to always remember that growth happens in the conversation. There's a lot of potential just simply learning from a conversation. And so we don't want this to be a monologue tonight. We want this to be a dialogue. We encourage you and invite you to join the conversation tonight on a number of ways. You can call in at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And you can also share any comments or questions on our social media platform, specifically on Facebook, where we'll be checking regularly in that chat room there. So next Monday, the second largest Christian tradition in the world, the Orthodox Church, is going to begin the sacred journey of Great Lent. Friends, Lent is a season in which Christians are challenged to pray, to fast, and to give those in need, all with the hope of drawing closer to each other and to Christ. In some ways, Lent is an opportunity to slow the pace of our lives, to create space for God in our lives. And throughout the Bible, friends, from cover to cover, we hear about the significance of prayer, fasting, and giving to those in need, and almsgiving. But really, how did Lent start? Was it always 40 days of fasting? What is the purpose, the real purpose of Great Lent? And why should we take this journey through Lent? Here to answer these questions and so much more is a very dear friend of ours, Dr. James Skedros. And let me just tell you a little bit about him before we begin to ask him some questions. Dr. Skedros is the Michael G. and Anastasia Kantonis Professor of Byzantine Studies at Hellenic College and Holy Cross Greek School of Theology, my alma mater. He served as Dean of Holy Cross from 2013 to 2018. Let me tell you, his teachings, research, and publication areas include the history of early and Byzantine Christianity, early Christian and Byzantine iconography, and Christian-Muslim relations. He is a double recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, both for the study of Byzantine saints in Thessaloniki, Greece, and he is currently the editor of the Greek Orthodox Theological Review. He's previously taught at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and is a lecturer on Greek at Harvard Divinity School. And just if I can, just to share just some personal privilege, and that is that Dr. Skedros was one of my professors. And as you know, on our show, we try to bring you the very best. I can tell you that you are going to enjoy tonight's show. So do me a favor, before we even ask him the very first question, get out a pen and some paper and take some notes, because it's going to be amazing. Dr. Skedros, as always, brother, welcome to Live with the Louhs.
Father Nick, thank you so much. Thanks for that nice introduction. Very kind and generous. And it's great to be here. Really, it's great to talk to you, and I'm excited about our conversation tonight.
Thank you, brother. And let's just get started. I think so many people may not even realize this, but because we just simply do this simply out of routine, especially on Wednesdays and Fridays, and obviously during the season of Great Lent. But can you speak to us about the history of fasting in general?
Yeah, sure. So, fasting as a spiritual religious discipline is not unique, obviously, to Christianity. Mm-hmm. It's a spiritual, religious, sort of practical, refocusing, activity that you see in a variety of religious traditions throughout history. But more specifically to us as Christians, fasting is really an integral part of our history, especially coming out of the Old Testament. So fasting is not unknown in the Old Testament. There's lots of references to fasting, lots of examples of fasting in the Old Testament. And for example, ancient Israelites would fast for the mourning of the dead. They might fast as an expression of penance, for intercession. Probably most famously, we think of sort of people like Moses or Elijah, who fasted, both of them fasted for 40 days before they were going to have an encounter, a theophany with God. And perhaps also for the ancient Israelites, the most important kind of day of fasting was the Day of Atonement, which was considered sort of a national and a liturgical fast for the ancient Israelites. Right. So Christianity, coming out of that tradition, right, coming out of the tradition of ancient Israel, has already in its identity this practice of fasting. And so therefore it's not strange to think that Christians would fast. And in particular, if we look at our own New Testament, Jesus himself fasted. Although the disciples, as you may recall, the disciples were pointed out for not fasting. The disciples of John didn't fast. And Jesus did fast, but Jesus' disciples weren't fasting, and Jesus gives a reason for that. But Christ fasted. We know that he fasted for 40 days right after his baptism, before he is tempted by the devil, and before he begins his public ministry. So there's that number 40 again. But also we read in the book of Acts that Paul himself fasted before his eventual baptism into the Christian church or into the Christian community. And so it's not surprising at all that fasting is a part of our identity as Christians. And I would say that it survived 2,000 years of Christianity in
Right.
all its diverse, in all the diverse expressions and developments throughout the history of Christianity. Fasting is still a part of, I would say, most Christian religious traditions,
Right.
most denominations, certainly in the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches, who, for these churches who put a lot of emphasis on Lent, in particular for us
Hmm.
Orthodox Christians, it might have maybe a more pronounced element to it, but it's still within the larger Christian tradition today of our Protestant brothers and sisters.
Right. I think early, I love this because now that when you go to a bookstore, especially any type of Christian bookstore, you're noticing that there are tons of books now on fasting. It's really quite, interesting. Whereas, I don't remember this early on in my ministry, at least, 20 or 25 years ago when I was at the seminary and looking at books, that there were books, that you would see to the abundance of what we're seeing now, and so I think that fasting is growing. I think that obviously that it's always been part of the general tenets of Christianity, but I think now it's one of those things where you're starting to see not only the different types of fasting that we see throughout Scripture, but also just the how so many churches are really sharing the importance of it. And we'll get later on in the show about really what are the true spiritual benefits of it. But I did want to kind of follow up with that with just asking, why was it so important? And a lot of times I think this kind of question happens. I hear this every year, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But why was it so important to fast from meat and dairy products?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? So I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, there's a physiological reason for meat. Now, I think we've sort of figured that out today with modern medicine and modern science and understanding of biology and physiology. We sort of have a sense of what meat does to us, but I think the ancients also understood that meat slows you down, that meat makes you tired. It's a heavy kind of meal. There's, I think, that piece to it. I think there's also a theological message. If one goes back to the Garden of Eden, it appears that Adam and Eve were to eat simply just from the fruits of the trees, etc., and not eat meat, not eat dairy products, anything that was cooked. It was sort of like, they were in a natural state of existence, and so there wasn't this sense that they had to prepare food. It was there. So I think that part of the not eating of or abstaining from meat and dairy products has this sense of a call to go back to a more theologically pristine moment in humanity's existence prior to the fall. We can't get there, obviously. I think that has a piece of it as well. The other piece is when we read Paul's letters in particular, when he talks about meat, he's often talking about idol meat. And I think there's probably a connection to that as well. That in the ancient world, meat in particular is a delicacy at some level, and meat isn't, eaten 5, 6, 7 times a week. It's something that is on the rarer side, and it tended to be associated with religious festivals. So think of Passover. Right? There's lamb that is cooked and eaten by the Jews for that festival. But if you leave the Israelite tradition, and go into the pagan world, meat is offered to idols. It's offered, it's sacrificed, it's cooked, and then it's shared as sort of a common meal in a sort of a festive way. So there might be that kind of, for Christianity and for Christians, there might be the sense of, well, we're going to stay away from meat. Paul said to stay away from meat offered to idols, and there probably is that connection as well. But I think more to the point, I think it's about preparation of food and the time one uses to prepare one's meals. And that fasting is a reduction of the intake of food, but also to get away from thinking so much about what I'm going to eat and thinking more about how I'm going to spend my time, as you said in your introductory remarks, about prayer and about almsgiving. That in the Christian tradition, fasting without prayer and almsgiving is simply a physical exercise.
Right, absolutely. I think it's so important too that you're sharing how I think with if we're not careful, again, as we were sharing at the top of the show, is that people can just simply get caught up in the meat and the dairy products without really knowing the essence. And I love how you share that so beautifully and yet simplistically. Is that really it's the time that almost the time that we're spending in preparing that food and kind of focusing on really getting back to the basics and spending that time with Christ. And I know that, obviously these days things are so readily available. You throw something in the microwave, you throw it into an air fryer, and it can be done in a few moments. But I do love the fact that it's, in many ways, it's getting us back to our authentic self and really kind of getting us back to that garden. So I love that. If you have a question, we invite you to join the conversation tonight. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions for Dr. James Skedros, you can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And we're also seeing all of you that are tuning in on our social media platforms. Wow, a lot of people are on there, so we thank you so much for that. You can definitely share your comments there. And we're talking with Dr. Skedros, as all of you know, about Lent, as it's just a few days away then and now. And I want to kind of continue this conversation, Dr. Skedros, by just asking you, why do you think fasting is such a general tenet, just such a pillar of the Orthodox Christian faith?
Yeah, I think fasting, as I said a bit earlier, that it's part of our historical tradition and our identity with ancient Israel. I think that's a piece of it. But I think also there's a real sense that fasting provides an opportunity to readjust and rethink. So in the early church, we see this fascinating document around the year 100 AD called the Didache. It's a text that was probably written somewhere between 90 and 110 AD. And it talks very briefly about fasting. And it says, don't fast as the Jews fast. It meant on the days the Jews would fast on Mondays and Thursdays, but Christians should fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. Imagine a text 100 AD already identifying a weekly regiment of fasting. That says something, that you're basically being told as a Christian, of those 7 days during the week, well, we know we spend one day remembering and commemorating the resurrection of Christ on Sunday. But those other 2 days of the week, we're asked to fast. And then the question is, why? Why is fasting so important? And your question is really important, because I think what happens for us as Christians, we think, oh no, Lent's coming, now I'm going to fast. Right, but really, fasting is an attitude. It's really an attitude, and that's why monastics, those male and female ascetics who dedicate their lives to an ascetic approach to life or a lifestyle, they really are continuously fasting. They don't eat meat. In general, at least in the Orthodox monastic tradition, meat is essentially, not eaten at all by monks or nuns. And I think that is a way for a monastic to say, I'm really redirecting my life. And fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays is a reminder that it's not about us. It's about our relationship with God, number one. And then number two, it's about our relationship with our fellow human being. And we spend most of our time during our lives thinking about ourselves and worrying about ourselves. And the church comes along and says, at least twice a week, think about something else other than yourself. I know that's a bit too simplistic, but I think that's why fasting starts very early on in the tradition of Christianity, that it's an important element. There is actually a diet out there these days where you're supposed to, I don't remember the name of it, maybe you know, but maybe one of our listeners knows, can type it in for us, but that says something that basically don't eat anything for 2 days out of 7 days a week. And you kind of go, whoa, that sounds very familiar. It sounds very familiar. But I think it really is, on the spiritual level, it's a way for us to remind ourselves that we are dependent upon God. We eat less. We don't need to worry as much about food, because really food is the most number one important thing that we have to sustain our life. And that as we bring in less food, worry less about food, hopefully it gives us the opportunity to think more about God, think more about our relationship with God and our relationships with others.
hmm And, for our listeners, Dr. Skedros, let's talk a little bit about those days that are, outside of Lent, the Wednesdays and the Fridays. Why are those fasting days? What is the
Yeah,
significance of those days?
yeah, that's a great question. So initially we don't really know. It sounds
hmm
like from this document that I just mentioned to you, this document written around 100 AD, that they said the Jews are fasting on Mondays and Thursdays. We don't want to be quite like the Jews because we're a little different. Remember, around 100 AD, Christianity is really kind of pulling itself away from its Jewish identity and really sort of, scholars talk about sort of the separation of these two siblings, rabbinic
hmm
Judaism and early Christianity. And I think part of that is we're gonna continue this tradition of fasting 2 days a week, but we're not going to do it on Mondays and Thursdays. We'll do it on Wednesdays and Fridays. Later on, the tradition, usually in the Orthodox tradition, tends to be explained, or it seems as more symbolic, that Friday is and we'll talk about this shortly, as sort of the commemoration of Christ's death and resurrection develops in the second, third, and fourth centuries. Friday is the day of his crucifixion. So it would make sense to fast on Fridays because it is a somber day. And although we don't necessarily reenact, Christ's crucifixion every Friday, we do it once a
hmm
year. Unlike Sundays, which is we're always every Sunday liturgically is the resurrection. And then Wednesday, I've heard some Orthodox theologians say that symbolically the Wednesday fast is referencing to the betrayal of Jesus. And Jesus is going to be betrayed by his disciple Judas. And therefore, that's another sort of somber moment. But I don't want us to think in terms of fasting as always a negative thing.
Right.
It does
I
have
love
that
that.
somber element to it. It does, but by thinking about Wednesday and Friday, as I just described symbolically, we then walk away and say, oh, well, then I've got to fast because I have to be, thinking sadly about these 2 days and events in Christ's life. And
hmm
to some extent, yes, but no. Fasting should be, I should say, very liberating
I
in a
love that.
sense, both spiritually and also, I
Absolutely.
think, physiologically, as we
hmm
now know. Clearly, we
Right.
now know these things. And too much
Exactly.
food is not good for us.
hmm
And that, in fact, there was a study done 30, 40 years ago
hmm
about the diet of monks in Egyptian deserts. And it was very clear that their diet was basically uh, equivalent to a diet that you would eat and consume food for longevity. And so it's not surprising that monks live into their 80s and 90s without any real access. Some monks in desert monasticism don't have access to medical attention.
Right. Right.
And they
Right.
can live these length of years, in part because of a really simple diet, which is what fasting provides us on one level.
Right. Right. So, let's just kind of dig a little bit deeper, Dr. Skedros. Can you just right before our break, maybe just share a few minutes about really the history of Great Lent? How did we get to where we are, what we're doing now during the season of Great Lent with the number of days that we have it? Like, how did Lent and this type of season, if you will, how did that evolve from the time of Christ to what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, sure. So, right. So, if we look at Scripture, we're looking, fervently for any evidence for Lent, we're not going to really find it. Maybe 40 days of Jesus fasting, but it really sort of develops. There's some controversy or discussion among scholars that look into these issues of the development of sort of liturgical practices in the history of Christianity. There's some discussion. It's not all that clear, but here are some of the signposts that we can sort of pick out along the way historically. First, as I already mentioned, Christ's resurrection was remembered every Sunday. And as from the earliest evidence from the New Testament supports that Christians gathered on Sunday, on the 8th day or the first day of the week. Both of those have theological, importance, but that was 2 ways to talk about that Sunday, that day that Christ rose from the grave. And every Sunday was the day of resurrection. And in fact, Origen in the 3rd century, in one of his commentaries, speaks very clearly about this. He's actually talking about the celebration and commemoration of Easter. And he says, but we shouldn't forget every Sunday is Easter. And so that starts things out. Sunday is Easter. And then it seems that probably by the middle of the 2nd century, around 140, 150 AD, it seems that that Christians are beginning to commemorate the day of Jesus' resurrection, either on the 14th of Nisan, which is the day of the first day of Passover, or the Sunday right after that 14th of Nisan. Nisan is a lunar month in the Jewish calendar, and it's a spring month as well. And so on that Sunday, and we do have evidence that Christians were gathering usually on Saturday night, and this is the Saturday night that they were going to. The next Sunday was the day that they were going to remember Christ's resurrection as a celebration, not just every Sunday, but this particular one Sunday out of every year. And it seems like Christians would gather probably around 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon, and then have sort of what we would call a vigil with mostly scripture readings and probably some hymns, and then it would end in the celebration of the Eucharist. It seems that event, and we have evidence for that clearly by 160, 170 AD, that commemoration over the next 50, 100 years might have expanded to 2 days. So it might have started on Friday evening or Saturday morning and then gone. And what we do know is that Christians fasted, that they fasted on that Saturday. They went to church. They went to their community. They celebrated. They had their long vigil. They wouldn't break the fast until it was time for the Eucharist, the celebration of the Eucharist. And that usually was probably right around the sunrise on Sunday morning. So it seems that initially our Lent, if you will, or our Holy Week was really all about remembering Christ's resurrection one day of the year, which came right around Passover, and then extended maybe to the Saturday right then, and maybe to the Friday right before as well.
Wow.
Now the question becomes, does it extend? And actually, we can continue if you want me to continue.
Absolutely. No, go ahead, please. Okay. Yeah, I think it's very interesting.
So then it seems that by sometime in the 3rd century, we have a fascinating letter from a bishop in Alexandria who's talking now about Christians who fast 3, 4, 5 days before Easter. And some of them are not eating anything, he says. He says others are eating maybe a little bread at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he says, but this practice I've seen this practice in Egypt, and I've seen some people do it from Monday, from Tuesday, or Wednesday. So now we seem to have maybe a longer period, almost up to a week, what we might consider now our Holy Week, but it's not Holy Week in the sense of days commemorating the last week of Jesus' life outside of the crucifixion and resurrection. Because remember, the Christians would celebrate the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection essentially at the same time. We've broken them up between Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. In the 2nd century, it was really right around on one day. Now, fast forward to the early 4th century, and then we kind of get to our Lenten period.
Right.
We start to see references in Greek and in Latin to the word 40th, or 40. We see the Greek word tesserakosti, or the Latin word quadragesimo, and that both mean 40. And at the Council of Nicaea, we're told in Canon 5 at the Council of Nicaea that bishops should gather in regional councils twice a year, once before the 40th days, or the 40 days, meaning Lent, and then one time in the fall. And then we see a letter from St. Athanasius of Alexandria, who now talks specifically about 40 days before Easter. So by the year 350, 370, 380 AD, 4th century, certainly by the end of the 4th century, we see Christians now pretty much in the West, in Rome and in the West, and in Jerusalem, in Egypt, in Asia Minor, in the East, celebrating a 40-day period of fasting, prior to Easter. And we don't, whether we have a Holy Week quite yet, actually we probably do have some semblance of a Holy Week by the end of the 4th century. The question is, where does that 40 come from? So really quickly, and then I'll wrap this up and we can chat a little bit more. There's a parallel development going on, and that is fasting before baptism. And we do know, back to this didache text, this text 100 AD, the author says that Christians who are about to be baptized should fast for 1 or 2 days before they are baptized. It also says that the person doing the baptism should fast, and it says that those who are in part of the community should fast as well.
Wow.
Around 150 AD, we have another text that says basically the same thing, that somebody that is about to be baptized should fast for a couple days before their baptism. The priest should fast, and the congregation, if they can fast, should fast with the person. Now, fast forward to the 4th century in Jerusalem. We have Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, who was Bishop of Jerusalem around 350 AD. He has written about 18 homilies or lessons for catechumens who are preparing for baptism at Easter. But he's telling these catechumens that you need to fast for about 40 days before you get baptized. So what scholars don't really know, and this is the debate, was it the baptismal fast, the pre-baptismal fast, that comes first, that gets tacked on to a commemoration around Easter time, because we do know that Easter was a very common time for people to be baptized, or was a kind of a sort of more organic development of Lent coming out of, well, let's fast before Easter 1 day, then maybe a week, and then maybe we'll extend it to 40 days because Jesus fasted for 40 days. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years, etc. I would say, and I think most people would think this, that it's probably a combination of both. That this pre-baptismal fasting that Christians are doing and this fasting that is taking place before Easter, 1 or 2 days before Easter in the 2nd century, will combine over 100, 200 years to develop into, by the year 400 AD, a clearly defined 40-day fast in both the East and the West. Sorry for being so long-winded.
No, I love that. I think it's so important for our listeners as they're tuning in tonight. I mean, just how fascinating that 40 days, that there was this pre-baptism fast, and which I don't remember, reading about. I love hearing that because, in which the priest would fast. Obviously the catechumen, the person wishing to be baptized, would fast. And if the congregation could also fast, they would fast. I mean, talk about, what a community, a church family, everyone participating in such a beautiful sacrament. I think it's extraordinary to hear that. And, for those of you that may be just exploring the Orthodox Christian faith, I think one of the things that you'll find very interesting is that in the Orthodox Church, oftentimes, because we still follow the calendar that Christ himself followed in his walk of faith, in his journey of life on this earth, is that we still follow the Julian calendar, in which the first full Sunday after the spring equinox, after Passover, and I'm probably missing another piece of that formula, Dr. Skedros, but we still do that.
You're good.
Yeah, and I think that's so beautiful that that they were already, these early Christians. If you're wondering when did the early Christians celebrate Easter, they were already celebrating it much the same way that we're still doing today. But I just love. I think our listeners and hopefully they're thinking the same thing I am. Is just how beautiful that is. That in this season of baptism, there's this opportunity for us also to that the themes of baptism are throughout the Holy Week, and obviously of Pascha, and just a beautiful way of the whole congregation fasting. And it's beautiful to see how this stuff is all kind of builds upon itself ultimately for not only our own spiritual walk of faith, but for others as well. So we're going to take a quick break right now, friends. And on the other side of the break, we're going to talk to Dr. Skedros about an interesting thing called dry fasting. So you'll definitely want to stay with us right here on Ancient Faith Radio. Stay right with us.
Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
Are you struggling in your walk with Christ? Do you want to rediscover your reason for living, the person you were created to be? Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan gives you the keys to unlock areas of your life that hold you back from fully experiencing the renewal and transformation God has in mind for you. Co-authored by a priest and a psychologist, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, Renewing You combines principles of spiritual growth with psychological tools to help you become your best self, fully connected with God's purpose for you. To purchase this book, please go to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. We're so grateful that you're joining us. Before we get back to our amazing speaker, Dr. James Skedros, just a couple of really quick announcements. On next Tuesday's show, many of you may have already heard about the movie Man of God. It's all about the life of Saint Nectarios, a major saint within the Orthodox Christian Church. There's a brand new movie coming out on March 21st and 28th called Man of God. The director of this movie, Elena Popovich, is going to be joining us next Tuesday. You do not want to miss this show. That show. It's going to be amazing to have someone as Elena to talk about really what drew her to producing and writing and directing this movie. So you'll definitely want to be there. It's next Tuesday at 8 p.m. So definitely tell your friends. And if you go to any of the local movie theaters that are near you, most of them will be playing that movie again on March 21st and 28th. The movie is called Man of God. And also, as we shared at the top of the show, we do these daily inspirational messages. And if you're looking for some daily inspiration in your own walk of faith, friends, go right now to our website at thelouhs.com. It's Louhs, thelouhs.com. Click on that subscribe button and simply put in your email address, and every day you're going to receive a daily word of encouragement from us. So hopefully you'll take us up on that offer. Dr. Skedros, we've been talking about Lent then and now. We're getting several questions that are coming in on our chat room. One question comes: where did the concept of giving something up for Lent come into play versus fasting from meat or dairy products? Well, where does that whole idea of giving something up come from?
Yeah, I think it comes from it's actually more of a Roman Catholic approach than an Orthodox approach, but I think Orthodox Christians have sort of adopted it, and I think it's part because these fasting rules, and we'll probably talk a little about them, at least in the Orthodox tradition, can sound a little bit arcane and seem quite harsh on some level. And especially post-Vatican II in the West, when the fasting rules in the Roman Catholic Church were relaxed, that hasn't been the case in the Orthodox Church. The idea of, instead of focusing so much on food, perhaps one ought to think about giving up something that actually might mean more to you and be more distracting to you than food. For example, binge watching shows during the 40 days or whatever, or some particular kind of food like soda or something. So I think that comes out of a post Vatican II, which was a council in the 1960s for the Roman Catholic Church that really tried to modernize the Roman Catholic tradition and to move away from some of these older regulations that seemed a bit outdated. The Orthodox Church hasn't really done that. However, I find the idea, especially when I talk to younger kids, especially teenage kids, and I mean this applies to all of us too. I do like the idea of limiting something that is perhaps we do all the time during Lent, and limiting it. And so I know myself, I like sports. And I know, I'll try to limit, in fact, I'll try not to listen to sports radio during Lent, or at least, just because, and actually it's a nice exercise to say, look, I don't necessarily need that. And I think in that sense, that's sort of like food, right? That's what fasting is about. We need food to survive, but we don't need the amount and the kinds of food, perhaps, that we eat on a daily basis, especially especially here in the West, where food is just so abundant for us.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, at some point, maybe in a very simplistic way, it's who's going to win. Is it going to be the soul or is it going to be the man? Like, who's in charge of my life? Who's in charge of my spiritual walk of faith? Am I going to let my flesh lead me, or am I going to allow God through my in my soul lead me? I love there's different types of fasting, and I wanted to get to this question that. I think it's just kind of a unique question that I think may be very interesting for our listeners is, what is dry fasting?
So it's an interesting phrase. It's a translation from the Greek word pseudophagi, which means literally dry or non-wet food. Mm-hmm. And I think the idea here is, at least in the ascetic tradition, monastic tradition in the Orthodoxies, it really meant that you don't use oil, any kind of oil, really, to cook your food. You basically eat sort of plain beans, maybe boiled in water, and some bread, dates, fruit, things that are just relatively natural. And again, it goes back to that notion of you're not going to spend a lot of time in the kitchen cooking. And one uses oil, one uses sauces, one uses these things to spice up meals, and we all love it. And there's nothing wrong with any of this. And one thing that we've sort of forgotten to mention here is that the kingdom of heaven, the imagery in the Gospels about the kingdom of heaven is banquet imagery. Yes. Our relationship with God in the end in the kingdom of heaven is described as a banquet. And we all love banquets. We all love sitting down and eating that wonderful food. And in the end, there's nothing wrong with it. But the church fasts in part because the bridegroom isn't around anymore. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus told his disciples when he was approached by some Pharisees, or his disciples, and the disciples of John came and said, look, we fast, the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast. And Jesus says, well, listen, you don't fast when the bridegroom's around. You don't fast when you're at a wedding party. And Jesus walking on earth was a wedding party. But he dies. He is crucified. He dies. He's buried. And he resurrects and he ascends, and he's no longer with us in some sense, right? Because he's in heaven, but he will come again. And in the parousia, at the second coming, we will have that banquet. We're not there yet, so we fast. And in some sense, fasting is a reminder that we're waiting for the parousia. We're not quite there yet. And so we're in anticipation. We're preparing so that when we do get to the parousia, we'll have that remarkable banquet. So dry fasting is just another kind of level of, of making your fast even stricter. And I would say that for Orthodox Christians, that level of fasting is really limited mostly to monastics in a monastic context. But according to Orthodox fasting rules, we're not supposed to use oil, but I would think most people in the Orthodox world still cook with some oil during Lent, because it's quite difficult not to. Some sort of fatty thing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to just ask. I mean, speaking of oils, why do the Orthodox fast from olive oil but not olives? I mean,
I know it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
I think again, it's back to that dry fasting idea. The olive oil is used to help cook the food, to make the food moist, to make the food more flavorful. And olive is something quite natural. And an olive is like a fruit which you can just pick and eat. And so it's not that the olive is bad. The olive oil is not bad or evil. And remember, we know Christ told us that food is not evil. Paul says that food is not, there's nothing evil about food. It's what we do with the food. It's how the food gets in the way of our relationship with God and others. That is what we're trying to curtail and to avoid. Thus we limit and we fast. Yeah.
You're listening to Live with the Louhs Friends. We're speaking with Dr. James Skedros, who is a professor at Hellenic College, Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. He's also a lecturer at Harvard Divinity School, and he is joining us talking about Lent then and now. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we welcome you to do so. You can call us right now at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question during the show at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. At the top of the show, Dr. Skedros, we were talking about these three pillars, if you will, of Lent, of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Can you talk a little bit about how all of these three are related and interrelated?
So it's a really important point, I think, because too often we get worried and focus on the rules of fasting, and we forget that that fasting without prayer and almsgiving, again, is just following a set of rules. There's a wonderful text, again, early church. I bring this up from the early church just to remind ourselves that these ideas are not something that, just all of a sudden the Orthodox Church in the 15th century came up with. But there's this text from the 2nd century called the Shepherd of Hermas. And in this text, written probably in Rome, around 150 AD or so, there's a discussion about fasting. And it seems that fasting was, in the early church, fasting was more of a complete fast and not a fast from certain foods, but a total fast. And so therefore you did it in short periods. You don't see these long, long pre-baptismal fasts or 40-day fasts, because you can't fast for 40 days without food or water, but you can go 1 or 2 days. And in this text, the Christians are told specifically that the money that you save on food from your fasting is to be given to the widow, to the orphan, to the poor. So right there in the 2nd century, there's this connection that you fasted for a whole day. You would have spent some money on food. Right. You fasted for a variety of reasons, one spiritual, maybe penitential, for whatever the reasons were for fasting, but you also didn't spend money. Take that money and give it to the poor. So there was a social dimension to fasting from the earliest times of Christianity. And I think the church emphasizes that throughout Lent and throughout its liturgical, throughout the hymnographic or the hymnography during Lent, is that, there are references to fasting, but these references are very much connected to this idea that one also needs to remember the poor, remember the less fortunate, remember that, we just last Sunday in the Orthodox Church, last Sunday, the gospel reading was from Matthew 25, the Last Judgment. And at the Last Judgment, that parable of the Last Judgment of the sheep and the goats, Jesus didn't, Jesus, the Lord doesn't come back and say, did you keep the fasting rules? The Lord comes back and says, did you visit me in prison? Or did you visit the sick? Did you clothe the naked? Did you feed the hungry? And so to fast without that social dimension, that social consciousness, would be Pharisaic in the worst sense of that.
Absolutely.
And I would say the other dimension is, and this is why in the Lenten season, you go to church more. Because if we fast without prayer, then again, it really revolves back to a set of rules. I don't do this, a set of do nots. Don't eat this, don't do that, don't eat that, don't eat that. Whereas if one has an active prayer life as well, I'm spending less time on food, and I am focusing more time on God and my neighbor through social outreach, and on God through prayer. There's this tradition within the Orthodox monastic world that the amount of food that one eats at a meal is not necessarily regulated, but the practice is that one should eat at a meal, if one is fasting, one should eat at a meal that you finish at the moment where you could probably eat more, but you don't need to. And could you get up and pray? Which is an interesting thought. Could you get up, or did you eat so much that you're tired and there's no way you could stand or sit and pray for 10 minutes because you'd fall asleep because you ate too much? So it's an interesting sort of thing that there again, this practice of how much am I going to eat while I'm fasting? Well, connected to prayer. I just finished my meal. Am I comfortable to go pray now? Or did I eat so much I can't even move?
Right. I love that, Dr. Skedros, as you're talking, I think it's so important for our listeners to remember that, when Christ does get angry with the Pharisees, who were people of faith, or at least identified themselves as people of faith, they were people who were, one would argue, were connected to God, but they made this so much about a rule, as you're saying, and not a tool. And I think it's so important too that, as you were talking, I kept thinking how the vertical shapes the horizontal, the vertical relationship with Christ, what we're doing during Lent, this prayer, this connectivity to Christ, this going to church more often through prayer, through fasting, should shape then, therefore, should bear fruits, if you will. And that fruits is to make a difference in this world, to utilize, whether it be our financial savings that we've had by fasting and using it to people and helping people that are in need. But as St. John Chrysostom says, and I know we'll definitely address this at some point, is that it talks about how we also on a spiritual level that we fast from food, but yet we devour our brothers and our sisters by the way in which we speak down to them and speak negatively towards them. So the vertical has to shape the horizontal. It has to shape how we are transmitting what we're doing for Christ and to Christ, to the way in which we're living out our lives towards others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that quote, that quote from St. John Chrysostom is so important, just to keep this all in perspective, that we can focus way too much on the rules,
right,
and forget about what's more important. And I like the way you phrased that. It's less about a rule and more about a tool.
Yeah.
I really like that a lot.
Yeah, it's just something that I've always kind of, even in my own walk of faith, I've always kind of make sure that what we're doing is not based on rules, but that there's that God doesn't really want our minds; He wants our hearts. I mean, and so if we forget to do that, we're just simply doing as Christ, and we hear this during the Holy Week services where we're just kind of whitewashed tombs. We're on the outside looking great, but on the inside we're just decaying because we're not doing the things that Christ yearned for us to do, what the purpose was when we fasted. And I think, as you mentioned earlier too, Dr. Skedros, and for our listeners to remember is, the Bible never says if you fast, it says when you fast. In other words, there's, like Christ is telling us, hey, there's a tool that is at your disposal that can help you draw closer to who you are called to be. And so I just encourage you as we're beginning this season of Lent is the journey with us. Take this journey of Great Lent through prayer, through fasting, and almsgiving. I promise you, if you do this with the right intentions and staying close to your church and your spiritual father, this will be a Lent that will be unlike any other Lent that you've ever experienced. We just have a few more moments before the end of our show, and so we welcome those of you that are wishing to talk to Dr. James Skedros. He's an amazing speaker and someone that just always inspires me every time I talk to him. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. You can also email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. That's ask@ancientfaith.com. And I love the comments that I'm seeing in our chat rooms on our social media platforms. So great to hear all of you. Dr. Skedros, we just have a few more moments in the show. And I just wanted to ask this question. Why do we fast for 1 week prior to Lent during Cheese Fair Week? And maybe talk about what Cheese Fair Week is and then why we do fast during that week.
Yeah, sure. It's really more of a calculation, and it's a bit different in the Latin Western Roman Church and the Orthodox Eastern Church.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is essentially trying to how does one get 40 days of fasting? And I encourage listeners to call up their calendars and start counting from Monday of Great Lent. The Orthodox Great Lent starts next Monday. Ash Wednesday for the Latin Church starts tomorrow, and to count 40 days forward, and you'll get some interesting calculations. And so to not make it too complicated,
mm-hmm.
in general, for the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church has 40 days from the Monday of Lent till Easter. The problem is there's not necessarily 40 fasting days, because in the Orthodox Church we don't count Saturdays and Sundays as fasting days.
Mm-hmm.
Sundays in the Latin Church are not counted as fasting days as well. And so for the Latin Church, because they don't count Sundays, they start Lent on a Wednesday to make up for the 4 or 5 Sundays that they missed during Lent that they're not technically fasting. The Orthodox, we don't count Saturdays and Sundays as fasting days, and we do a little different calculation when it comes to Holy Week. So we need to make up 5 additional fast days.
Mm-hmm.
And so the church puts those fast days in what we call cheese fair. And that is the week that we're in now, where it's a lightened fast. It's only fasting from meat. Dairy products are allowed all week, but only from meat. And it gives us an extra 5 days, Monday through Friday, of fasting. Actually not extra, but it gets us 5 days to add to the 35 during Lent that are considered fasting days to get to the number of 40. So it's basically a computational move that develops probably not until the 6th or 7th centuries, maybe even a little bit later. And all these sort of days and numbers, 40s and whatnot, the number 40 is pretty established by the 4th century. How to count the 40 days differs in a variety of geographical locations and at a variety of different times over, say, 300, 400, 500 years from about the 4th century to the 8th or 9th century, when they finally get solidified in both for the Western tradition and then the Eastern tradition.
Let me ask you, just for our listeners, just out of curiosity, the whole idea of Ash Wednesday. What is the, what are the reasons why it's called Ash Wednesday?
Yeah, so the tradition in the Latin Church was to take the palms from the previous Easter, and those palms will dry out, and then they keep them, and then on Ash Wednesday they burn them, and the ashes from that is marked on the forehead of a Catholic who goes to church on that day. And that is meant really as it's a really sort of powerful penitential activity to remind people that Lent is not, it's not a festive period, although, again, we don't want to think of fasting as doom and gloom, because Jesus tells us that. Don't fast with doom and gloom on your face. But it's also time to remind us that the 40 days are at some level penitential. And just like the 40 years in the desert, maybe not penitential, but they were years of wandering, or the 40 years in the desert, or the 40 days in the desert of Christ fasting. These aren't great feasting periods. And so in that sense, Lent is sort of has this level of a potential penitential element to it. And that's where that the reference to those palms that have been kept in churches for a year. They use those, they burn those, and then they anoint. And it's just a reminder. It's sort of also the sense of, again, it's more penitential than anything, and a reminder that Lent has that element to it. We don't have that tradition in the Orthodox Church in the East, although we do have a sense of our first day or two of Lent tend to be, we call our first day of Lent Clean Monday.
Right.
And that's a real emphasis for us as Orthodox to really start out thinking that this is a really important day. It's the first day of Lent. It's a day to kind of say, I'm going to set my sights on a good Lent, and I'm going to try to do everything as good as I can. I will try my best, but I'm not going to beat myself up if I don't reach where I want to get. But and so we say Clean Monday is sort of a special day where we try to fast a little bit more on that first day of Lent. It's not really like an Ash Wednesday, but the idea is sort of the same.
Dr. Skedros, I could listen to you all night. I just love you sharing with all of us this just some very practical ways of how Lent was established, how it kind of grew over the years, but more importantly, how transformational it is. And I hope and pray that for all of us as listeners, that what you're hearing tonight wasn't just informational, but it's transformational. And I hope as we all begin Great Lent next Monday, that let's do all that we can to grow closer to Christ and to each other, and to ultimately make a difference in this world. Dr. Skedros, thanks so much for joining us tonight on Live with the Louhs. We are always honored to have you on our show, and please give our love to your family, and you're always welcome back to come onto our show.
It's great to be with you, Father Nick. Thank you so much, and a blessed Lent to you and your family.
Thank you, my friend. We also want to thank Matushka Truda for producing our show, and all the great people at Ancient Faith. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. And again, if you've enjoyed this show, we encourage you to join our social media platforms. We're all under the headings of the Louhs. And we also encourage you to join our daily inspirational messages. You can go to thelouhs.com, click on that subscribe button, and just simply put in your email address. And don't forget, next Tuesday, we're interviewing the director of the brand new movie that's coming out on March 21st called Man of God. We're interviewing Yelena Popovich. This is a show you do not want to miss, and invite all your friends to join us. That's next Tuesday, 8 p.m., right here on Ancient Faith Radio. God bless you all, my friends, and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of the book Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.